Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I would like to share my rankings of the books that I put on my alternative Women's Prize TBR way back in March. Earlier this year I decided to create an alternative Women's Prize TBR simply because I wasn't purchasing any new books and I wanted to come up with a way that I could read more of the books from my shelves. And so I pulled off 16 books by women writers that I anticipated being 5 stars. And I decided to do this at the same time as the Women's Prize because that has been something that I've followed for a few years. Not wholeheartedly, but it's always something that I've looked at that list and I've acquired books from or got them from the library when I've been interested in them. And I wasn't doing that because I was so heavily focused on the books that were on my shelves. Therefore, I created this list and I'll leave a link to the original video in the description. But it's been a few months, the Women's Prize have announced their winner now, and I'd hoped to have got all of these books read prior to that. But sometimes things get in the way. Anyway, I am just going to go from my lowest ranking book to my top ranking book, and we can see what book won my alternative Women's Prize. I should also say these books weren't from 2023 and 2024. The book that came in at the bottom, number 16, was Blaming by Elizabeth Taylor. I had hoped that all of Elizabeth Taylor's works would prove to be new favourites. She is certainly a favourite author of mine now, having read all of her books. But Blaming was the last book that she ever released. It was published posthumously and she knew that she was going to die, so she was rushing to get this book finished. And unfortunately, I think that you can tell that within the prose. Certain climactic moments occur and it felt like they were only put there to give a finality to the novel, and it just didn't feel as though the themes were explored as well as they had been in other works by the author. Something that happened quite early on in my reading of these books was making the decision that I could DNF them if I wanted to, and that came from the fact that I would have done that thing if I was following the actual Women's Prize. And so the next couple of books that I have here are both books that I DNF'd, but I felt like they were still of a higher quality than Blaming. So next we have The Burgess Boys by Elizabeth Strout. I've been looking forward to this book for the longest time because I am a fan of Elizabeth Strout as a writer, but I knew how this book was going to end based on another book that I'd read by this author. It took me like 10 days to read 100 pages. I was exceptionally reticent to pick this book up, and whilst I recognise that the right-wing views of the characters aren't necessarily the views of the author, I found it a very difficult read because of that, and I just couldn't necessarily deal with all the hate that was present within this book at the time. Maybe I should have read it because everything going on in the country at the moment feels very apt to what's going on in this book and the way that these characters are operating and the huge family secret that they have. But because I knew it was going to happen, I felt like I didn't really care for this book too much, but Elizabeth Strout is still a phenomenal writer. And then we have Sea Change by Gina Chung. Last year when I went to Whitby, I got into this whole thing of wanting to read weird fiction, and I anticipated this being a weird fiction sort of book. We follow the character of Ro, who has developed this adoration for this octopus in the aquarium where she works because it was the octopus that her father found however many years before. But I didn't realise that this was another book about a depressed woman moving, as YouTube has so helpfully coined the phrase. And after 100 pages, I don't much care for this sort of fiction, and so I was never going to like this book, despite the fact that I think that the writing is quite good. And if you're a fan of short stories and that style of the American short story writer, then I think you'll get on with Gina Chung's work, but it just wasn't a book for me. And then we have Patricia Wants to Cuddle, where this woman called Renee is part of this show called The Catch, which is a bit like The Bachelor, and she knows that she's not necessarily going to win, and she knows why she's been chosen to be part of this. She's also hiding her sexuality throughout this book. Then it kind of takes this turn of this, on the front it says queer horror comedy, but I don't know where the comedy was. I have to be able to suspend my disbelief a certain amount when it comes to fiction, and I could not suspend my disbelief long enough with this book. It felt very irreverent, it felt like a one and done type book, and I really didn't care for it at all. I do have a review for this that I'll link somewhere. Then we have a book that I'm disappointed that's so low on the list, and that is The Furrows by Namwali Serpell. I think that this book tried a lot, but it didn't necessarily achieve what it was seeking to do, and what the book was doing I've seen done better elsewhere, is how I'll leave things with this. I really enjoy Namwali Serpell's writing. I have to give credit there. When I read their words, it's like, you know, it's like a knife through butter. A hot knife through butter, you know the phrase. But I just didn't particularly get on with the way that The Furrows was written. I felt like the first 150 pages were completely disconnected from the end of the book, and the resolution just wasn't there for me, and the ending just felt like cataclysm for the sake of having this cataclysmic event. Yeah, it's a shame, but as an exploration of grief in the first 150 pages, I was here for it. Weirdly, I put the two explorations of grief next to each other, because then we have We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. And I still talk about the fact that I went to Bakewell last year and I picked this book up in a charity shop. She'd literally just put it out on the shelf, and I grabbed it, saw that it was a new release, and decided that I wanted it. So this is really a book about friendship and grief, and the grief that we feel prior to a death, when we know that this death is going to occur. And it was looking at that sense of limbo, really. You're stuck in this liminal space because you know your friend's going to die, you know the grief that you're going to feel, but they're still holding on to some hope that this isn't going to happen, but you're also having to prepare for the worst, and you're also having to examine your entire life with this person. And for a short book, it did that incredibly well, but I don't know that it just went far enough for me. It's not one that I ever think I'm ever going to return to. And then we have Soul Tourist by Bernardine Evaristo, which has some fantastic moments in here. And I'm going to be lending this to a friend still, because I think that she's really going to get something out of it. And as a piece of fiction to look at on a craft level, I think that it does great things. But I think that it misses the mark when it comes on to telling the story as a whole. I like that it went back into the past and it looked at the lives of forgotten Black women throughout history. And I sometimes really appreciated that part of the tale, but then there were so many moments that I just felt like, what are we getting at? And I think there was so much that the author wanted to talk about that they didn't necessarily hit everything as much as they thought they had done. Yeah, missed the mark is a good way to describe this one. Then we have Amy and Lan by Sadie Jones. I actually got through this one rather quickly, but again, it felt like a one and done type book. If it didn't tell me at the start of each chapter which character was speaking, then I don't think that I would have been able to remember who these characters were, which is true. They didn't have enough of a distinctive voice, which maybe is what the author was going for, because they are two young friends. It's a book that was trying something, and I don't necessarily think it achieved it, but I did appreciate the tale of this different sort of family and the way that these characters played off one another, and seeing everything through the child's gaze, because it gives a sense of dramatic irony to the tale. And then we have Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Malinda, a brilliant sapphic story set in the 1950s, and Lily, who is exploring her burgeoning sexuality at a time when people are turning against the Chinese Americans and also don't have much nice to say about queer people. It's a brilliantly told tale, and I think that it explores the topic of someone finding out who they are and discovering their sexuality quite well. I think that it is indicative of the time, and the story goes how this story would go given the historical context. It was interesting to see a part of history that I didn't know about previously, but it's also a book I feel like, again, one and done, never going to return to. Then we have A Change of Climate by Hilary Mantel. This is in this position because I like Hilary Mantel's writing, but I can remember there were a few occasions when reading this book where I began to question the authorial intent behind certain decisions and certain things that happened within the novel. As I think more about this book, I am remembering more plot points that were spoilers. I can't remember whether I shared my thoughts at the time, but I think it was a strong Hilary Mantel novel, even if there were some moments which left me uncomfortable due to what the characters were saying and having to try and decipher whether this was an authorial opinion or just a negative opinion because of what these characters had gone through, and it was just indicative of what and who these characters were, if that makes sense. Anyway, this is the position it's in. So then we have Darling by India Knight. And this is not a book that I own. I was lent this by my good friend Joy. And I think I've told the story about how my parents wanted me to go with them to Waterstones because they wanted to buy me a specific book for Christmas. And then the Waterstones seller said they didn't have it, and I knew that they would. So I walked straight into Waterstones with them and ended up having to get it off the shelf because I knew where it would be. And then my dad saw Darling by India Knight, and I read the blurb and thought it wouldn't be for me. But it turns out that my father had done it again, and I should have just let him. This is a man who doesn't read, but sometimes he can just figure out something from the cover. And anyway, I adore Darling. It's made me want to go and read the original tale by Nancy Mitford and then come back and reread this one and see the parallels that they have with one another. Really enjoyed my time. I enjoyed the family. It reminded me of the weird and wonderful characters that Kate Atkinson writes about, and that's always a win with me. Another great book was An Academic Question by Barbara Pym. My volunteer still questions me as to why I like this, because I don't think it's her favourite Barbara Pym, but I've only read 3 Barbara Pym books at the moment, and this one follows Caro Grimstone. Caro goes to read to this old academic and steals his manuscript for her husband because he believes the research will help his own findings, but then people begin to suspect something unethical has occurred. And I just like Pym's witty writing. How I'll leave things, I like this. Then we have How We Disappeared by Jing-Jing Lee. Although I don't think I will ever reread this book, I think, again, like others in this set, it was one and done. I'm glad to have read it, and I think that the writing and the telling of the story, similarly to what I've talked about with other books here, was superb. I was also grateful to learn more about a period in history that I didn't necessarily know about. I knew about the Second World War, but I didn't know what was happening in the country that is discussed within How We Disappeared. I didn't know the way that these women were affected or the societal implications of that. And this is a very grim, disturbing read because it feels, these are things that happened, and you begin to wonder about these people who were kind of lost because they were no longer wanted by their families, but they thought that they were doing good by their family. And it was just, any time you thought that you could get over one heartbreak, Jing-Jing Lee would pile another one on. And it was a very well written story, even if it was so suffused with sadness. Which is something that I could also say for In Limbo by Deb JJ Lee. It was the graphic memoir that I put on the list, and I still very much enjoy the colour palette and this tale of a young person experiencing depression, but the way that it's tackled from the Korean American perspective, because there is a belief of parenting and mental health within that culture that really makes it difficult for our protagonist. I don't think I'll be able to find it, but the way that the author also managed to draw light sources in here, and the way that they brightened up the page with just a phone, and what that meant for the actual tale, it was just... This is an exceptional piece of memoir, and a way that I hadn't thought of memoir being told before. I haven't explored many memoirs told in the graphic form, but I can see why it was necessary for the telling of this tale. And then we have Motherthing by Ainslee Hogarth, one of my favourites of this year. Completely suits my sensibilities. Basically, Abby's mother-in-law has died, and then Abby begins to feel like she is being haunted because maybe she stole something from her mother-in-law's corpse. And this is such a grotesque black comedy filled with, it's like Blythe Spirits and the Addams Family, and it's got a goriness to it, but it's got a humour there, and I just was wholeheartedly invested in this tale, loved the narratorial voice, loved absolutely every single thing about this book, completely suited my sensibilities to a T for being mildly grotesque but humorous. I can cope with a bit of grim if it's going to be humorous, and Motherthing was certainly that. And then my top book, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, is The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn. Which means this was the winner of my alternative women's prize, really. So when I first discovered this book, I wanted it because I thought it was going to remind me of what I liked most about Kate Atkinson, and it did. I keep saying that this would be a great book for fans of Life After Life, but also of The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Anne-Marie Crowhurst. This is a book that discusses the theatre, it discusses family, and it has this against the backdrop of the First World War and subsequently the Second World War. It discusses class at the time, it discusses extended families and new families and feelings of belonging. And it manages to discuss very different aspects of the Second World War and what this meant for everybody who was fighting at the time. And yet the core of this book is the house. We've got the characters that live there, but the central point, the place that the characters all come back to, is this stately home. And I like that as being the sun in which all of these other characters orbit. It does deal with death and it deals with grief from that death, but every death up until a certain point feels as though it's shrugged off, as though there is a lack of importance and a lack of noticing these things because the characters were never really around for other characters to grieve their loss. But then we get to see it when a character actually meant something to the others. And of course we were going to see that because of the Second World War. And I've just read this quote from Mick Herron on the front: love, grief and comedy in perfect balance. And I quite agree with that. So thoroughly impressed with this book. Very much look forward to returning to it one day. There's just something within this book that is compelling and humorous and fizzes. And I always like a book that does that. And them's the books. That is my ranking of my alternative women's prize TBR/long list. 16 books that I took from my shelves, hoping that they would all be new favourites. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, but I did get to explore so many topics and themes that I had maybe been avoiding for a little bit. And also I like that even though I didn't know what some of these books were about, there was still links between quite a lot of them. We had weird fiction, we had tales of grief and death. In fact, maybe that's just something that I head to a lot. We've talked in the past on my channel about the rather abnormal fact that death is a favourite theme of mine and seeing grief explored through fiction. And I think that that's definitely something that is included in the majority of these books. If you've read any of these books and would have ranked them differently, then please feel free to let me know in the comments. Also, if you just want to talk about a singular book, that's fine as well. I'm here for all of the discussion and the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video because until next time, that is all.